So I played the original Silent Hill 2 not too long ago because it's one of those games that you see constantly being brought up by the horror gaming community as just a generational masterpiece and a classic that needs to be experienced by everyone. And after playing it, I wholeheartedly agree. It's one of those pieces of horror that does more than just scare the shit out of you, and it actually tells a very emotional tale that affected me deeply. Silent Hill 2 also has a very unique vibe that I can't say that I've really experienced in any other horror game. Nothing is quite like it. The animations, voice acting, weird camera angles, everything about this game's atmosphere is just unique to itself. So when the remake was announced, I naturally saw a ton of immediate criticism just among fans. Some argue that the vibe of the PS2 classic is just such a product of its time that trying to recapture that in the modern era is just not going to be successful no matter who's doing it. People are also incredibly attached to that original group of cast members, and I mean, I'm no exception. And the last time they recast them, it didn't go too well.
Anyway? What do you mean, anyway?
People were also really dissatisfied at the choice of Bloober Team to be the ones making it, which I personally had no input on because I haven't played any of the Bloober games. I've just heard they're not that good. Once the actual gameplay footage dropped, things were not looking good for the remake, and my reaction went something like, this looks really clunky. But you know what? I guess that's just the state of the gaming industry right now, okay? Companies like to just put out unfinished pieces of shit and just optimize and, patch things over the next few months after everyone has already moved on to something new. Oh, wait a second. It says here that Konami used footage from a really early build in the game. That means there's still hope. But regardless of whether this remake was actually going to be good or not, I was for its existence from day one. As long as the people making it are getting paid well, then I don't see an issue with really any remakes existing, even though a lot of people think that they're kind of oversaturated right now. And plus, I think that more people getting interested in Silent Hill 2, like if it's bad, they'll just be more likely to play the original and they wouldn't have picked it up before. And, there's some people who just look at a PS2 game, even though there is the enhanced edition, and they just go, this feels too dated, and I just don't want to give it a go. And for those people, they at least get to experience this same legendary story, even if it isn't as good as the old one was. Also, I think that remakes in general should take some creative liberties. Otherwise, I would just prefer an HD upscale edition, which, we have that, and it slaps. Also, I firmly believe that any art form is just at its best when people are pouring their own emotions into it. I mean, that's like the whole point of art. As long as it remains true to the DNA of the original, I'm fine with these creative liberties that they may take. And I'm just gonna say it, there are a lot of dated aspects that could use some upgrades, because of how gaming has evolved since the PS2 era. Like the limited camera angles, for example. Sometimes they actually really enhance the game on a thematic level. Like that part in Toluca Prison, for example, when James enters the interrogation room and we see this. It's a pretty on-the-nose representation of James's perception of himself. Weirdly, one of the most memorable moments in the franchise for me is Silent Hill 1, when you go down that alley for the first time and they do that weird, that kind of thing with the camera, that, it's kind of cool, okay, even though it's frustrating from a gameplay experience. Literally later on in the prison, there's this part where you get chased by Pyramid Head in this hexagonal room, and I ain't gonna defend this. This was just pain. I think the reason that limited camera angles died out was, one, the frustration, and two, it's just not as immersive as a first or third person view. And the director of the original actually went on record to say that he does prefer the new third person camera over the limited camera angles. And honestly, I'm really inclined to agree with him. This did help the immersion for me, and I think those cool cinematic moments can still be there, just in the form of cutscenes, which they added a few extra, and we'll talk about them in a minute. I also played this game on PS5 because my computer is just solid for gaming, it's not S tier, so I wanted the best looking experience that I possibly could get. And also, if I can get the physical release for a game, I'm always going to prefer that because I am a physical media snob, if you couldn't tell. And I tried capturing my gameplay with my capture card, but it turns out this is kind of a piece of shit. The image just looked really bad, so I am going to be using a full playthrough video, so if it doesn't quite match up with what I'm saying when I describe my own playthrough, that's why. But in the future, I will try and get a better capture card, so that way I can actually stream PS5 games and have a better looking image for the camera on stream, because this is the thing I was using. It kind of doesn't look as bad with the camera, but it looked bad with the PS5. So I'll mention real quick that the PS5 version is not currently optimized, at least not when I'm recording this. I think they are patching it. yeah, no version of the game runs super well. The PC version has some stuttering, and the PS5 version just has a really inconsistent frame rate. Like, thankfully, there's really no glitches. Well, there was like one or two I encountered, but like, it was a polished game. It just didn't run really well, and that's, again, that sad state of the gaming industry that I was talking about earlier. You can tell they were trying to rush to meet that spooky season deadline, but I don't know. I think that it's always worth it to delay a game so that way you put out a more polished product, something that runs perfectly on launch. And like, it was almost that, but it was just like 2 more months in the oven would have just had a perfect experience, I think. But I don't know about the actual technical aspects of programming, so I could be wrong in that, but that's just my take. I think it should have been delayed a little bit more. The vibe that you as the player get going through this dilapidated, bleak town is reflective of James's emotions as a character and changes based on how he feels. This, coupled with the incredible environmental storytelling, both with the models themselves and with newspaper clippings, old notes, and everything, like there's just this whole background story that's being told here. And it was very much like this in the original, but Bloober took the groundwork that the original had laid and they expanded upon it and just made the world even more fleshed out than it already was. And the iconic fog just looks better than ever. The fog actually interacts with the world in a way that fog would. Like, it isn't just we put a fog effect in the town. Seriously, I recommend going and watching the video on Bloober's channel just talking about how they program the fog, because it made me appreciate something I already appreciated even more. They've also added an optional 90s filter to remain true to the original's film grain look, which I know was a way to hide the imperfections in PS2 models, and it is a hardware limitation, but an argument can really be made for the fact that the film grain of the original made it just feel really grimy and disgusting. But I personally went with the modern look because I just want a fresh new experience, you know? I think the closer we get to looking exactly like reality in films, TV, gaming, whatever, the more we crave the way that old movies looked. I really like that the modern version still has this tiny little VHS effect on the edges of the screen, just to kind of make you feel that little bit of nostalgia. But it is just a really cool garnish for what is otherwise an extremely true-to-life looking world. And this hyper-realism with the world makes the monsters within it feel all the scarier because it makes them feel a lot more otherworldly, like they shouldn't be there. And while the visuals were incredible with what they did, I think the real highlight of the immersion in this game is its sound design. I played this thing with my really nice noise-canceling headphones, and my god, there were moments in this game where I legit thought something was happening in the other room or outside, and I had to take them off and check because I'm like, it sounds too close to real life. Every time you finish a fight, the game gives you a quick break from all of this horrifying ambient noise, and then it slowly begins to creep back in, and you begin feeling on edge again. And then it starts putting in sound effects like this. All of the sounds just toy with your fear of the unknown, and you don't know how close this thing is, you don't know what this thing is. It's unclear, but it doesn't sound fictional. It sounds real. And like I mentioned earlier, I watched some of these Bloober making of videos, and they talk a lot about using darkness to their advantage as another means of tapping into that very fear of the unknown. So while it is terrifying enough just hearing creepy noises in areas that are decently lit, they are even scarier in darker areas like the prison, because it forces your mind to wander even more. And even as someone who is desensitized to a lot of horror things and horror tropes, these sound effects still really put me on edge. Like, I gotta hand it to them. I seriously think that the prison, just in its entirety, is a masterwork in horror. You will be checking the walls constantly to fight off these sneaky motherfuckers. Every time I thought that I had fully cleared the area of these things, nope. And it was also a little weird hearing some of the original OST over this new version of Silent Hill, but after playing for a few hours, I really got used to it and wouldn't have it any other way. I think that that original soundtrack is just so unique to Silent Hill that, like, you need that to create the atmosphere that the original did. Before we take a look at the remake's combat, I want to take a minute to step back and look at what made the original's combat so good and why it worked for exactly what it was trying to do. It does feel kind of clunky, especially nowadays, but this was definitely by design. There were these really long startup animations every time that you're about to hit an enemy, and this is great for two reasons. One, it builds a lot of suspense every time you try and hit an enemy, and you're like, am I going to get this hit in time? or am I going to get some acid to the face? And I think it works better for James as a character that, you know, he's not going to be able to swing this thing like at the speed that Dante from Devil May Cry would. Like, think about it. If you're swinging this thing like 500 times a day, you're going to be doing it really slow, especially by the end of it. It really succeeds at making you feel like this dude who just actually has no combat experience and is genuinely fearing for his life. Something I also really like is this light mechanic, where basically, if you want to navigate this world, you're going to have to turn on your light to look at your map. But if you do that, you are going to get swarmed by enemies. The world is also just generally pretty dark, and while you can navigate without your flashlight, it's really difficult. So you have to be really careful when you use it. But even for how much I do like this system, I'll be the first to say as well, there are rooms for improvement. Just spamming trigger on an enemy is not the most incredible combat. Like, there could be a little bit more variation, and I think that would make it perfect. So that's exactly what the remake did. If you wanted to spam trigger at any of these enemies in the remake, they are going to hit you anyway. Like, you can only get in like 2 or 3 hits, and then you have to start dodging. It's a staple of just modern combat in general in video games, and I think that if I were in James's shoes, I would be dodging more than I'd be hitting. But yeah, each enemy has its own unique moveset, and you're gonna have to get accustomed to that. And not only that, there's some enemies that actually have like a darker alternate version that's just even harder to beat than the original one. That close combat dodge strategy developed when fighting the normal versions is no more when they bring this attack out. And when you beat it, it spits acid all over itself, which also messes with this tendency you developed to relentlessly stomp on these things after they've been downed. Also, these fights are just this constant smooth flow of animation, and there's no clipping or anything like that. Being that the game is made in Unreal Engine 5, they were able to utilize motion matching to make all of James' movements feel fluid. And I think just having this smooth, constant flow really goes a long way in the immersion element. Every time that James knocks a creature down, it always just feels like he hits them with the right amount of force and at the right area to allow for that. You also could run around some of these enemies in the original, even in hard mode, and I think this was also a design choice because, you know, it's more realistic for you to want to just run past some of these things, avoid confrontation, and only fight when you absolutely need to. Like, you don't get rewarded by killing these things. Plus, you're not the fastest guy in the world, so you do get a lot of anxiety when you try and run past these things. And it's really easy to get hurt in the process. That said though, I do respect the remake for making these enemies just feel way more threatening and a lot harder to bypass because it does make them feel like more of a threat. Whether you're running past an enemy or you're fighting it, you're still experiencing suspense, so like I think at the end of the day, both systems just work well for what they want to do. Also, you rarely know when to expect combat encounters. The original achieved these surprise encounters by having a balanced number of unsafe rooms with monsters versus safe rooms with save points or puzzles. You never know what to expect when you open a door. The remake does this too, but it places these enemies in really creative ways that give you this constant suspenseful feeling throughout every single area. Because it's not limited by the hardware of a PS2, we don't have this go into hallway, go into room, reveal type method. Instead, it's just enemies placed all throughout this whole entire map. Even if the area initially feels safe, you never quite know until you've seen all of it, which actually is a big advantage of that third-person camera I mentioned earlier. You have to actually explore the room rather than seeing it all at once. But I wanted to save the best part of the combat discussion for last, and that is the boss fights. Oh my god. A lot of the aspects of this game, I just appreciate both a lot, but the boss fights are one that it's like, no, I'm hard taking the stance that these boss fights are better than the original. Like, a lot of the original's boss fights were just running to one corner of the room, shooting, running to the other corner of the room, shooting. But the remake was constantly just introducing these new mechanics for every boss that happened, and I'm not going to show any gameplay of that or really go in depth about that because I do want to keep this section of the review spoiler free, but there is actually one boss fight in particular that I will go into in the story section because I believe it to just be a masterwork in just boss fight environmental kind of storytelling in general. Like, when you incorporate storytelling into gameplay, like, that's something I really always appreciate because it's something that's unique to gaming. Like, you can't achieve that in any other medium. So I really got to talk about it later on. The overall gameplay in the remake was just stellar. Like the original, each area has 3 big overarching puzzle pieces to collect, and you get those by solving smaller puzzles. Going from one place to the next felt like a very streamlined experience, and it was never a chore to navigate any of these places. I also really like that when you walk at the doors, you don't actually have to interact with them to open them. Like, this kind of should just be a standard in gaming right now. Like, you're gonna go into the door if you walk up to it. Like, why else would you do that? If it doesn't open, it just does this animation of James kind of pushing it and just moving on. It's super quick, and I loved it. You also no longer have to pause to bring up your inventory to either switch weapons or use items or anything like that. You just walk up to a thing that you can interact with, and boom, your inventory's right there. It was also nice that they took advantage of the combine mechanic a lot more. Like, I think I used it like 2 times in the original, but this time you used it a lot. This is a game that has a lot of quality of life improvements, all of which I've just mentioned. Like, you can tell these people actively play a lot of games, they know exactly what makes a streamlined experience. So it blows my mind that somehow this wall breaking mechanic made it all the way through development. You do this like 40 times in the game, and it's just 3 taps of the trigger spaced out, and not just 1 hit of the trigger and an animation playing. It is a nitpick at the end of the day, but I mean, it disrupted the pacing a lot, so I decided to mention it. Now let's talk about the puzzles. I have no shame in admitting that, yeah, I looked up a guide a few times in the original. Like, how was I supposed to make the mental connection that the way to solve the garbage chute puzzle was a 6-pack of juice? But the remake actually had me Googling, like, almost none at all. The one puzzle that I caved for, by the way, was in the motel section, when you had to get this combination lock. Also, this is technically a puzzle spoiler, so if you want, you can mute the video, wait for this bar to run out on the spoiler warning, and then unmute it. But anyways, you had to follow this note, right? And you had to do a math problem to get a certain combination. Well, the thing is, no matter if you do easy, medium, or hard difficulty, you will get 3 digits. But for some reason, they decided to make the lock 4 digits. I sat there for like 5 minutes being like, what way could I like reinterpret this message that allows me to get to a 4-digit answer? Like, this just doesn't make any sense. Turns out the answer was actually to just put a 0 as the first digit in the combination lock. And I'm just like, nowhere else in the game is there a 4-digit code for a 3-digit number. Like, it just, like, why did they not just make it 3 digits? Like, what was the reason for that, Bloober? Like, why? But other than that, the puzzles were just the right amount of difficult. And you remember how I mentioned that garbage chute puzzle that involved the fucking 6-pack of juice? Well, what happens in this game is when you find the 6-pack of juice, the garbage chute is just right next to it, and the little X is gonna come up on the screen, so you'll be able to tell, oh, this is the thing I can interact with. And, oh, here's this in my items, fuck it. It's as if they're just saying with this, yes, we are aware that the original had some bullshit puzzles, so we're either gonna cut them or make them like this. The puzzles that they did keep were just expanded upon and made to be even more crazy, and there was a lot of original puzzles that I just thought were really cool with the way that they all came together. And I mean, this is exactly what I was hoping for in a remake that has a lot of puzzles. Like, give me some original stuff, so I'm not just going through the motions because I already know it. And yeah, this game delivered. And finally, we're at the bulk of this video. So yeah, spoiler warning for everything going forward. Just skip to the closing section and then go play the game yourself, and then come back and watch the story section. But if you've seen it, then just sit back and enjoy the next, I don't know how many minutes this is gonna be. But it's gonna be a lot. Also, there is a content warning at the beginning of the game. I figure I'm just gonna echo that here because, again, if I'm talking about this story, I'm gonna get into some of these topics that are, you know, put in the content warning. So here you go.
In my restless dreams, I see that town. Silent Hill.
Alright, so now that Adult Swim has finally started, let's talk about the Polaroid pictures and the glimpses of the past. The glimpses of the past are just kinda cool. If you played the original, then you'll be like, oh, I remember that! It's just kind of fan servicey, and I could take it or leave it. Now, some people think that the glimpses of the past confirm the whole time loop theory, where everything in Silent Hill 2 is this time loop. But no, I think that would just make a lot of the endings pointless. If James doesn't leave and leave, then what's the point of leave? If he doesn't die in water, then what's the point of in water? Like, why? No. Now, the Polaroids are more on the ambiguous side. We don't quite know what they mean. I think a lot of them are just snapshots of James's life, especially where he's like starting his new job and shit like that. Some of them were possibly taken by Mary on their original trip to Silent Hill. There's also some oddballs like this one that says ready to kill it. Like, I get the vibe that this is supposed to be from Maria's perspective, but then like, why is James the one that finds it? Maybe James visited a strip club after she died, or possibly even during the 3 years of illness. I'm currently editing, and a theory that I just thought of is maybe the kill is just meant to foreshadow Maria being killed later on. I didn't initially think that that could be what kill in this context meant, but like, it's Silent Hill. It could be anything, really. Anyways, I like the ambiguity. I like that it gives us room to theorize and interpret it in different ways, and let me know what you guys think of some of them in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious at the meaning of some of these. Like, they are really interesting. As it turns out, in the process of me editing this video, there was actually a Redditor who figured out the whole Polaroid puzzle. And the message translates to, "You've been here for 2 decades." Now, immediately, my mind went to the theory that, if I remember correctly, just clowned on a minute ago in this fucking video. But this still just does not confirm the loop theory, all right? I think this is solely a message for the player and not for James. But Bloober is never going to confirm or deny the loop theory, as they really shouldn't. I think part of the fun of this game is actually the fact that it's ambiguous. Like, I'll tell you straight up that I personally don't like the theory because of reasons I just mentioned earlier. But even though that's my opinion, I think that if you really like the loop theory and you get enjoyment out of it, then more power to you. Like, bottom line, it makes me happier to see more people enjoying this game. Anyways, let's talk about the voice acting. Like I mentioned earlier, that original cast really does have a special place in my heart. Like, they are those characters. Like, it is just incredible what they accomplished back in the day. But man, these new voice actors, holy shit, they were really great. I see a lot of people criticizing Maria's actress, but honestly, I think she did a pretty great job. I mean, really just performances in general. I don't think there was one that I'd specifically put as like the crown jewel amongst them. Like, they were all very good. It's also a lot less David Lynch-ish this time around, but there is still those like uncanny undertones in otherwise really believable sounding dialogue. I also think the motion capture was just fucking gorgeous. Like, you can really see the emotion in these characters' faces when they really need to show it. The characters also look just like their real-life counterparts, which I think is just perfect for getting a really authentic performance from the actors. By the way, I am strictly going to be talking about changes made to the story, because a full-blown breakdown of the narrative of Silent Hill 2 would be best in its own dedicated video. The first few scenes are pretty close to the original, but things really start getting different when Maria gets introduced. So I'm going to start by focusing on everything having to do with her character. Before we really get started with the Maria section though, I want to take a minute to go over what my interpretation for what Maria actually is. She's an idealized version of Mary, whose goal is to attract James, and she, Pyramid Head, and the monsters were all created by the town as a way to both punish James and get him to confront his sins and deal with his guilt. It's simple, right? Well, things get incredibly complex once you take a look at the Born from a Wish episode, which is in the director's cut of the original and not on the remake, but we still gotta talk about it anyway, okay? It is important for understanding Maria. It shows how Maria develops into the person that she is when she first meets James. We see that she was created to have these false memories and that she has an innate desire to find another human being because she's afraid of being alone. And on her journey, she finds a ghost named Ernest Baldwin. As much as I really want to just deep dive and pick apart the conversations that she has with Ernest, because they are incredibly interesting and thought-provoking in their own right, this is a video about the Silent Hill 2 remake, so I'm going to do my best to keep it short and get through this section as quick as possible. But immediately once you see her talking to Ernest, your first thought is, why is she allowed to do that? I believe she's allowed to because she hasn't really figured out what her own identity is yet, and she's still kind of being made into the Maria that we see in the game. Once she gets to that point though, that's when she can't interact with the other things in the other worlds, and she can only interact with the ones personal to James. But once she does finally figure it out, the town calls her to see James as she's ready to fulfill her purpose. So she is not necessarily part of James' psyche, but she is born from James' psyche. And it's so interesting because while she's technically her own being, she doesn't have true free will because she has a fixed motivation that she cannot stray from. So now that we've established that as a baseline, we can talk about the rest of the game and Maria as a character. I just wanted to get that out of the way first, just so that way I don't talk about it throughout the fucking analysis, because that would just be too much. James and Maria's first meeting was just incredible, as expected, but one of the differences I notice in this version is that it's actually Maria who suggests what Mary would have been referring to when she said she was waiting in their special place. And in the original, it's James who comes up with the idea that it's a hotel. Maria suggesting that they go to another place, which is actually not the hotel, but instead a spot where couples typically go on dates, shows the beginnings of her attempts to manipulate James into filling the void left by Mary with her. In the original, Maria asks James James,
I look like Mary, don't I? You loved her, right? Or maybe you hated her.
in the remake, they cut her suggesting this idea that he hated her, probably because Laura said a similar thing earlier.
You didn't love Mary anyway.
But I also think that her just asking the question rather than suggesting an answer is really interesting.
You loved her, didn't you? Didn't you?
All right, just... Come on.
James has to think about how he felt towards Mary in two different ways. One where the thought is just directly blurted out at him, and the other where he has to look within himself. Because we saw Laura shout at James earlier, we're thinking about this possibility that he didn't love Mary in the back of our heads, and James's facial expression here says it all. Also, James does reveal that he hated Mary in the Leave ending, so it's not like they cut this from the game entirely, like you still get to see it. And something I really began to notice when I started heavily studying the nuances of each version of the character, original Maria often directly tells James these hard truths that he initially tries to suppress, but remake Maria puts him in situations that causes him to think deeply about himself about these same truths and deal with them that way. What's so great about this change is that Maria still serves the same purpose in regards to what she is supposed to do for James in the story. And you can tell exactly what he's thinking based off of his body language and facial expressions, which I believe to be the right choice, not just because it's a fresh take on Maria, or because it shows Luke Roberts' incredible talent as an actor, but it's because Bloober just said, hey, if we have the technology to really get detailed facial expressions in the game, we're gonna take advantage of it, and write a lot of scenes in the story that allow for these characters to just have a lot of silent moments where you just see their facial expressions shine. I also thought that it was a super nice touch that Maria and James just interact as they're going through the town. Like, yeah, this does happen a lot in gaming nowadays, but it was just a nice touch I want to mention. And normally a scene where Maria holds up her original outfit would just seem like tasteless fan service. Which, okay, yes, it still kind of is, but again, the idea of Maria just going up to this motel room, finding an outfit that's a little bit more revealing than what she has on currently, and then holding it up, asking James to imagine her in it, like this just causes him to fantasize what she would look like in it, and that's exactly what Maria would do. The absolute peak of the Maria editions, in my opinion, is when they arrive at Heaven's Night, where Maria's flirtiness is like dialed up even more than it is in the original. Like, yeah, the purpose of Heaven's Night was pretty clear in the original. So yes, this may not be necessary, but it was just such a good addition because the cutscene was really in line with these characters. Like, Maria definitely knew what she was doing when she asked for a break, and James initially didn't give it to her, and she starts crying, reeling him in to try and manipulate James into comforting her. And once she succeeds, James shifts his mentality from focusing on Mary to wondering if she's even really there. And that's when Maria knows she's got him and brings out the alcohol. The original showed James's alcoholism by only revealing his history with alcohol if you walk up and interact with some crates, thus showing James kind of just being drawn to it. But he ultimately resists the urge after thinking about it. The remake does this with this close-up shot of James's face. Not a single line of dialogue here is uttered about James's history with alcohol, but you can tell that he is a recovering alcoholic just based off of this scene. Incorporating it into the gameplay and using the motion capture are both really creative ways to show this, and I like both of them for what they are. And before we move on from Heaven's Night, I just want to point out real quick that you can actually find a wedding ring in the Lost and Found, and James isn't wearing his wedding band either. Like, you can even tell that it was removed very recently because, you know, the actual murder took place like 3 days ago rather than 3 years ago. So yeah, just everything about the Heaven's Night section was just incredibly well done. Anyways, we then find out that the place that they're going to is actually the garden, where we're greeted to yet another new cutscene in which he tells James about an old folktale. It's pretty on the nose foreshadowing of later events in the game. You can also find a me heart she on one of the benches, which may just be Bloober showing us with the environment that this is a special place for couples yet again. But I don't know, it could tie in with Maria sitting James down on the bench like that. I really considered cutting this from the script, by the way, because it seems a little bit extra and tinfoil hat-ish, but like, I'm putting it in anyway, because you know what? I'm leaving no stone unturned here. When you get to the hospital, you can also see James's apprehensiveness to leave Maria on the bed with both long pauses and his body language when she asks to take a break to lie down. He's getting a flashback to when Mary first had to stay at the hospital, and he also has a feeling that if he does that again, he's going to lose Maria too, but he's still dead set on Mary. It's great foreshadowing for her death. which was just really brutal, especially when compared to the original. Like, I knew everything was coming, obviously, but it really got me when instead of seeing the hand slip through the elevator, we just saw Maria's expression change from something full of life to this, which is exactly what James must have saw when he took the pillow off of Mary. I also really like that after she lies down on the bed, it starts raining on the rooftop and James's walk to the next area, which you don't quite understand the meaning behind the recurring motif of the rain yet, but it is a reference to the in-water ending. So the rain is meant to represent James contemplating suicide. And I think if you played the original, you can kind of figure it out as it happens, because the world being surrounded by water, like what else could that remind you of? There's also this bit where you learn that Pyramid Head's sword acts as this mechanism for pushing all these fleshy limbs just moving everywhere like crazy, and you use his sword to pass through another set of these limbs and progress through the game. It's never explained what this actually is, like 100% up to our interpretation. I kind of lean towards this idea that it's James reliving the murder yet again. I think that this fleshy wall is James's perception of Mary's sick body. Then we find ourselves in the hotel where we meet Laura again, and like while Laura isn't Maria, I think that I'm just going to briefly talk about this scene here because there's not enough like Laura stuff that it could justify its own section. They're a bit nicer to each other this time around than they were in the original, and I think this chemistry is just really adorable. But later on, things get painful, as they always do at this game, and we finally get to the point where James watches the tape. The following scene is just incredibly faithful to the original, as I really think it should be for a moment like this. But I did really like the addition to have Mary just seem kind of faded as she gets up. And the addition of more camera angles during the actual death just made it even harder to watch. Seeing the footage cut off to James just sitting there, realizing the truth but having a hard time accepting it, was conveyed very well here. But I gotta say, the transition to the other worlds just made me out loud, alone in the dark room, go, oh fuck. Unfortunately, though, the game was not perfect as far as the James and Mary stuff goes. There is this moment where James talks to one of the doctors about her life expectancy through a tape recording that was cut, which they did as one of those glimpses from the past, and I really wished we got to see that in the remake. I think Bloober probably thought that the idea of this floating bed appearing outside the window is just a little bit too weird for the remake, because it does overall have a more grounded vibe than the original did. But I personally think that it should have just been an audio recording. Like, you don't need it to be visual. Like, this is actually a thing in the game that influences one of your endings, so it's like, I think that this was just really important. To be fair, there was a recording in the hospital section that kind of had a similar vibe to this, but this recording I think is just so personal to James that I just can't really imagine the story without it. And again, yes, it is an optional thing, like it is part of your ability to get an ending, but it's like, I think that's why it should be there, you know? But speaking of endings, this is as far as we can go talking about Maria without getting into the endings, which I have sections for as well. So it's time to talk about the best additions to this story. And that's all of the scenes with Angela. You have to be extremely careful when writing characters that have the kind of trauma that Angela has, because you have to make sure that you are respectful to people who have actually dealt with abuse involving family members. So mad respect to Bloober for doing this character justice and handling the topic well. Angela's brother and father were very abusive, and it's not confirmed, but it's implied that they may have sexually assaulted her throughout her life. I'm personally a firm believer in the theory that Angela killed her entire family, including her mom. Like, it's not a coincidence that the first time we see Angela, she's examining a headstone. She feels pretty justified in killing her father and brother, but her mother offered some semblance of comfort to Angela. But at the same time, she was an enabler to the men in the household. And instead of putting the blame on the men, she starts blaming Angela for their actions.
Even Mama said it. I deserve what happened.
But even despite all that, she holds on to hope that her mother would comfort her in the same way that she used to, like when she was much younger before the abuse started happening. And I think Angela calling her mom Mama instead of Mom is showing that she is kind of regressing to this time where she was just fully safe. It's the same way that James wishes he could return to the past and be with a Mary that wasn't terminally ill. Angela wants to be back in that earlier point in her life. To start off with the new scenes, we find ourselves back in the garden again. Angela begins to worry that all of this was for nothing, that her mom isn't really here. And this is just a perfect parallel for the other new scene where James has the exact same thoughts. And Gianna Kiel's delivery of this next line just hurts.
She doesn't want to see me anymore.
The long bits of silence in this conversation are uncomfortable. James is trying desperately to understand Angela, but given what she's been through and how hard it is for her to trust people out of fear that they may hurt her, it's just more realistic for her not to open up about her feelings yet. And man, Angela's just initial joy in hearing that someone's glad to see her.
Happy to see me?
And then for James to just correct himself, saying,
alive. I mean,
but she takes it as though he doesn't care about her feelings and only cares about the fact that she's alive. It's exactly what she experienced growing up, which is just devastating. And it really hurts me when James suggests sticking together to see if they can find a way out of here, and her response is this.
Out of where?
It implies that she doesn't see a difference between Silent Hill and the outside world, and that everything is just as bad no matter where she goes. James then asks if she's seen a little girl running around, and hearing those specific words again causes Angela to perceive James as her father.
A little girl?
yeah, Angela?
No. Please. You shouldn't be here.
Angela, it's okay.
No, don't touch me!
I almost couldn't focus on the next 15 minutes of gameplay because this scene just affected me so deeply. I've consumed a lot of psychological horror. I mean, literally, I'm in the perfect blue hoodie right now. And as desensitized as I am to a lot of horror, this is the kind of stuff that will never fail to get under my skin. When you take these characters that are really believable and grounded with the way that they speak and who they are, and you combine their fears and trauma into just something like the abstract daddy, that to me is just the most disturbing that horror can get. In the original, the fight was just running and shooting in one room. But the remake has you running through winding hallways that just seem to go on, twisting and turning almost like a nightmare. There are even moments after you've shot it a few times where you feel like you're almost safe, only for him to come crashing through the walls yet again. The entire sequence puts you directly in Angela's shoes, and that part where you go into the cracks in the wall and you see her hiding place, that was... I'm legitimately tearing up thinking about it. The most horrifying part of the entire fight, though, is when you listen to the tape recording on the TV.
Makes you sick. Care of you all these years. What I did? Look at me!
And the moment that Angela would try and fight back, after the fight, Angela is worried that James is now going to trick her into thinking that everything's okay, just like her father did. But he assures her he only wants to find his Mary.
Your own little Mary.
I think she says it like this because it reminds her of My Little Angela or My Little Girl or phrases like that. She probably also feels as though James views her as someone he owns. And my God, her performance when she finally has a read on James and figures him out is just really well done.
What?
Admit it. You didn't want her around anymore.
And just take a look at Angela's face when they're mid-arguing and he delivers a strong no.
No.
You probably found someone else.
No!
The way she reacts almost seems like she's disassociating in the moment, which makes sense as that is a defense mechanism for what would normally come after a harsh no like that in her past. And then she just leaves. I think that the staircase scene is just one of the best scenes in the entire game, if not the best. Everything here is revealed about Angela's character, and we finally see her open up emotionally and tell us what she's really thinking. She really starts to question her self-worth, especially after all of the years of negativity from her family. She challenges James by asking if he is even capable of giving her the comfort that she so desperately wants. But James just stands there, looking down, thinking of what happened when he tried to comfort Mary and how that ended up. Seeing that her perception of the town is not just a personal hell, but a literal hell, and her dead father and brother on the wall there constantly haunting her, with James being the one good thing amongst all of that, Everything about this scene is just, to me, the peak of this whole game. The remake's take on it was mostly faithful to the original, except they cut two things. One being James standing there, looking dejected, which I'm fine with. I mean, we really feel it in the emotions just by watching the scene. The other thing that they cut was James not saying, "I'd never kill myself." I think that Bloober probably looked at this and was like, well, this is kind of inconsistent with, the in-water ending. But the way I interpret it is that James is having just conflicting thoughts. He's just on the fence right now, and he's either not going to do it or he's going to do it, and that's why you're still not at the in-water ending or not yet. Like, James walks in on Angela in front of the mirror for a reason. So what we see in these scenes with Angela is reflective of James as a person. And James also finds himself in a place where he feels as though he deserves to burn in hell, so they correlate perfectly. In the original, Angela asks James if he could take care of her and heal her pain. In the remake, it's as a response to something else James said.
What we're looking for, it's not here.
Angela assumes that the only thing that he could mean by this is that they could be what the other person is looking for, which makes for a very smooth transition to her next question.
Or maybe you think you can save me?
James refuses to answer because, well, he doesn't. So Angela turns around and leaves. In the original, the dead bodies that you see are literally James's same character model, but altered. And that aspect carried over to the remake. And even when Eddie dies, he kinda looks like James. The main difference in the first scene with Eddie is that James no longer asks if he's friends with that red pyramid thing, and I think that was cut because most people in James's situation wouldn't even assume that they could be friends. Could you imagine Eddie and Pyramid Head just being bros? But yeah, this was definitely meant to tell the audience early on that Pyramid Head is exclusive to James. But I can respect the remake for wanting to keep it a mystery for right now. If you played the original, you'll be very quick to notice that this next scene doesn't take place in the bowling alley, and instead it takes place in a theater. I think Bloober just really wanted you to walk around looking for Laura a bit longer. It's kind of hard to do that in a bowling alley, like they're not the biggest places in the world. And to show that Eddie does more than just binge eating to cope with the stress by having him also watch a film. But you can actually find the bowling alley if you are determined enough to explore every single corner of the world.
This town's full of monsters. Who could just sit here and eat pizza?
It's great that they took time to model it out and put it in as an Easter egg, or maybe they just had it modeled out, scrapped it, and just moved it over there and said theater instead. The next scene with Eddie is one for one of the original, but with slight changes. It's the part where Eddie tries to justify killing someone because they looked at him in a way he didn't like. And finally, we get to the bit where Eddie goes nuts. The original opens on James asking Eddie what he's done, but this time, Eddie is monologuing before James even gets there. Remember how I mentioned that these models are the same as James? Well, when Eddie isn't talking to James directly here, he is talking to a James corpse, so I really like the addition of this line.
How many times do I have to kill you?
I also like that they remain true to the original with the way that it's edited with all of these quick cuts of different angles. In my opinion, the original just goes too over the top with the cutting, because it just gets really headache-inducing watching this. And I think the remake just does the perfect amount of this without making me want to throw up. I also like that James doesn't need to ask if he's gone nuts for Eddie to come to this conclusion that James looks at him in a condescending manner. It shows that he's even more delusional than he was in the original. James also now decks Eddie in the face when he gets closer to him, and I was shocked that Eddie didn't immediately try and fight back and shoot at James when that happened. Because at the end of the original scene, Eddie shoots at James, and you then have to shoot him a few times before he runs into the boss room, and you can do the fight. And I mean, this is someone who is just killing people willy-nilly, going on this whole monologue about how he's tired of having people push him around. But then I realized it. Even though Eddie is saying that he's done being pushed around, he still has this natural tendency to run and cower in fear. I doubt any of the people Eddie has killed thus far have fought back in the way that James did, if at all. So Eddie experiencing resistance for the first time since he made this decision, it just kind of makes sense to me that he would revert back to his old ways. After the fight is over though, to my surprise, we didn't get that iconic scene where James goes,
I killed a human being.
I think they cut the scene because these cutscenes are meant to emulate real life. You can kind of get away with an internal monologue in the PS2 era, but this looking much closer to modern film, a voiceover is just going to come off as awkward. But I think James standing there horrified, it's not like they didn't acknowledge this at all. They did still show that he feels guilt from this. Plus, this is totally a callback to the beginning of the game where James is washing his hands off in the sink and he looks down with the hands like that right after he killed Mary. I mean, 3 days after, but it still is a callback, I think. And also the open hands to closed fists. Like, it's as if he's saying, like, I feel guilty, but if I let myself mourn and get hung up over this and think about it too much, then I'm not going to find Mary. And that ultimately is the priority right now. So now we're at the part you've all been waiting for, the ending discussion, because there's definitely a lot of changes with the endings that I really want to rip into. The Leave ending starts off with James confronting Mary. Okay, most of them do this, but anyways. And he finally realizes that he has to leave this fake reality for a real one. The way that this concept is presented in the original is that Mary shuts down James's delusion and says this in response to being called Mary.
Mary's dead. You killed her.
The remake plays out a bit differently though, with Maria initially embracing Mary's identity and James realizing that she's not really his wife once he hugs her. And given each Maria's acting performance and writing throughout the game, I think both scenes just work very well. Remember, original Maria has a tendency to just blurt out James' suppressed thoughts, and this scene to me almost feels like a portrayal of finishing the grieving process. When you finally just hit that point where you stop denying the death of a loved one and it just hits you that they're really gone. New Maria also challenges James, but it's by putting him in these tempting situations or asking him really deep questions. I find it believable that Remake James can put the pieces together and figure out what's really going on after he sees for himself what the voice calling out to him was. He knows that logically, Mary cannot still be alive, but hearing her call out to him after watching the tape just also doesn't make any logical sense. All it takes is for one hug for him to realize, yeah, this is it. This is just Maria, and that's the moment where he fully accepts the truth. And I'm not saying the remake doesn't do this, it's just that he's the one telling himself Mary's dead and you killed her in his thoughts and not from Maria. It was also interesting to see him pity Maria being this separate being created from him because, I mean, he is the reason that she exists, but he cannot allow himself to be with her. So after the fight, James and Mary have their final conversation, where James finally admits that he killed her because he grew to hate her. The only difference is that Mary waits till the end of the letter this time to tell James to continue living rather than telling it to him then and there on the bed. And this really hit me in the feels, especially because this was the ending that I got when I played through the remake. But that said, Silent Hill is not a place that you go to for therapy. It's a place where your sins catch up to you and you are forced to confront them. And how you proceed after that can go many different ways. So let's get into the ending that I actually got on my playthrough of the original. In water. So starting off, the initial confrontation here is just exactly how it was in Leave. And to me, this is just really disappointing. Yes, the originals in Water used a pretty similar script, but there are some few key differences. The biggest difference that sticks out to me, though, was the fact that the actors had very different line delivery between the two endings.
Mary?
Mary's dead. You killed her.
Mary?
Mary's dead. You killed her.
In Leave, we have James going into this encounter with optimism, and Maria laying out the hard facts in a more informative manner rather than trying to guilt James, thus making for a smoother transition for James to accept the past for what it is. But in Water, he goes into this encounter confused at how he's seeing Mary, and then only made to feel more guilty once she uses this super convicting tone of voice. And as for the differences in the script, I'm not going to go into detail about every one, but it's pretty clear why
It's time to end this nightmare.
shows James going down a path to leaving the town, and
Problem is, you're not Mary.
shows James consumed by his guilt and not wanting to live without her. And what comes next in the Leave ending is portrayed from a high angle to show that James has the power here, and in the In Water ending, it's portrayed from a low angle to show that James is powerless. And yeah, these dialogues don't have too many glaring differences, but it's just the nuances that I think make a world of difference for what James is feeling as a character in that moment. Especially something like a camera angle. Like, I don't think that would have been that much harder to program in. And then what happens next is there is no bed scene. And this is the most disappointing thing about this ending, because of the fact that the original's In Water bedside conversation was different than the original's Leave bedside conversation. James saying this,
I tried. I really did, but I can't go on without you. I can't forgive myself for what I've done.
does not have the depth that this does.
I told you that I wanted to die, James.
That's why I did it, honey. I just couldn't watch you suffer. That's not the whole truth. You also said that you didn't want to die. The truth is, part of me hated you for taking away my life.
You killed me, and you're suffering for it. It's enough, James.
Mary?
James brings Mary to his car, and the next line of dialogue tells us why James came to Silent Hill in the first place. And they cut that. Instead of meeting Mary here, James looks into the backseat because he wants to believe that she is still alive, but instead, he's met with nothing and he doesn't have this last conversation. In a way, it does show that he is accepting that she's really gone, but to achieve this and the same beats that the original ending did, a monologue was their only option. And these are the same people who cut James's "I killed a human being" monologue, so I was left scratching my head. Like, that was a great example of show don't tell storytelling, whereas this version of In Water is just telling and not showing. We know that this isn't how this conversation really went down, so the scene is meant to show that James is coming up with his own version of Mary's final moments as a way of dealing with his guilt. And I will say, for as much as I am disappointed with this ending, I do appreciate the cinematography choice of putting this camera kind of in front of Mary looking at James. Even though her body is literally there, it makes it feel as though she's really gone and James is just having to process that. But we get this teeny bit of cloth in the back of the car to show that, yeah, she actually is there, but it's just this camera choice that was actually pretty clever. I will definitely hand it to them on that. And we do know that it is legitimately back in the car because of hacks. But overall, it just really makes for a version of the In Water ending that just feels incomplete. Because it actually is. The In Water ending in this version of the game is laying the groundwork for the Stillness ending, which you can now get in New Game Plus after doing the In Water ending. Going into it, we know that James is probably going to look back at Mary's body, but to our surprise, we see this. They didn't want the bedside conversation in Water because they were saving it for here. We see James just break down and cry through his second apology, and because we've already seen the contents of the letter at the end of In Water, we know that the real Mary wanted James to live, and this makes James feel even worse about the situation. It cuts to an open letter on the seat now, putting the ambiguity of whether he read it or not to bed. This is someone we've already seen kill themselves because they couldn't live with the guilt, so we know he has every intention to do that once he gets into this car. But feeling Mary's presence again, James just doesn't know what to do. He then asks her one final question.
Will you wait for me?
James. I've always been waiting for you.
The way this scene is written makes me feel almost as though it's actually Mary talking to James from the afterlife, and that's why he isn't able to just fully get a good look at her. It almost reminds me of Maria not being able to see Ernest, even though they can talk. Not a perfect comparison, obviously, but you could also interpret this as James fighting the urge to give in to the delusion of Maria again. In the end, he starts the car and drives off, just like in Water. But if you listen to the audio very closely, and it took me many times to do this, but I think I hear it now. It seems like James got out of the car just in time. He can wait to see Mary in the afterlife, and he can live a full life and die a natural death. I think that the changes made to In Water were worth it in the end because of how good this ending was. It was something that you needed In Water knowledge to go into, but once you have that, it is just incredible. And like I said at the very beginning of this video, a remake never takes away from what the original accomplished. And I still look at that version of In Water as an incredibly well-written ending. But this was yet another massive risk from Bloober. And I think they ended up cooking. If there is anything in this game that tells me that Bloober understands Silent Hill 2, okay, I really wanted to just say the Stillness ending here, but no, the Angela stuff was just still... That was the best thing, okay? That was my favorite, but this is really close, okay? I really love this ending. Honestly, I can't pick a favorite ending out of the original. I think they're all really great in their own aspect. But in the remake, this is my favorite ending. It's such a good idea. Like, Leave and In Water both make sense to me when I look at James as a character, but this is the midpoint of that. And it's just, it takes the best things from both and it just, it's so good. It's so good. It's so fucking good. Oh, wait a second. Hold on a minute. I'm getting a call.
Hey, yo, Aaron. I like the Silent Hill video, but like, doesn't it confirm the time loop theory to have Stillness come after In Water?
The beginning of the Maria ending's confrontation with Mary is more or less the same in the remake, and I will also be referring to her as Mary throughout this section because it just doesn't make sense for James to kill Maria to be with Maria. This fight is, I think, just simply meant to show James moving past his desire to want to be with Mary. In the original, Mary's response to James saying that it was a long 3 years was,
That's why you needed this Maria person? James, do you really think I could ever forgive you for what you did?
And while I do like this idea of Mary just instantly shutting James down, because yeah, I think that someone being with the bootleg version of yourself, like, that's a little bit infuriating if you ask me. But in that same manner that Maria tested James back on the dock when they first met, Mary kind of asks a similar question.
It was a long 3 years. I was so tired.
I guess I understand. I know I was a burden. You wanted a long, happy life, something I couldn't give. Can she?
This line does kind of spoil that Maria is going to fall to the same fate that Mary did.
You'd better do something about that cough.
It's not a full-blown spoiler, but like they did kind of just load Chekhov's gun right there, and like I think anyone who's playing this game can piece together that yeah, it's gonna be fired after the fight. So I do like how the original saves the reveal for the very end, but at the same time I also do kind of like this line for what it is. Like, it is consistent with how Maria/Mary has been written throughout this whole game. And given what Maria literally is, Mary just having the same traits makes sense. Maria was born from James and Mary is just his delusion, so they're pretty similar in that aspect. So I think given all that and really thinking about it, I think I'm on board with this change, even if it does hurt the actual reveal. Like, it works for this game. Something I also want to point out is that they actually reference the long 3 years quote right before they get to the bar.
3 years. That's a long time.
It's some great foreshadowing. And lastly, the way that the camera zooms out and we see Mary's composure just begin to crack, all to have her say this.
Those were the last precious moments I had. How could I ever forgive you?
I love this extension of the scene. And Rosewater Park being where James and Maria meet works best for the original, but I couldn't imagine the remake having this happen anywhere other than Heaven's Night, because that additional scene was the closest that James got to abandoning his quest for Mary and staying with Maria. She even suggests returning there if they get tired as they're departing.
We could come back later if you want, you know, in case we need a break.
And this decision to have almost zero dialogue until they actually leave the town was just genius, because I don't think this scene needs much at all. This Maria was so confident that James would abandon Mary for her that him doing this was just expected. Like, remember, Maria is just here to do one specific goal, be with James and be what he wants her to be. And then we get that iconic moment with the cough. Yet another just really well done ending. The original Rebirth ending has James go into the fight having fully come to terms with the fact that what he's talking to isn't Mary, and he has to sever all ties. But the reveal that he has this whole plan about using the old god's power to bring Mary back is kept hidden until the very end of this whole monologue. But the way that you get this ending, like, you can kind of piece together what James's plan is based on the items you get throughout the story. Which is why I like that in the remake, they actually had James vaguely go into what he was gonna do with this confrontation scene. And oh my god, Maria's performance when she realizes that all hope is lost is some of the most convincing acting that we've seen from the actress, whose name I've been avoiding saying out of fear that I'd pronounce it incorrectly this whole time.
My name is Salome Gunnarsdottir and I play Mary/Maria.
Who the hell do you think you are? You don't get to say this. Not anymore.
So I think I like this ending a bit more in terms of the script itself, but man, there is just something really special about the original Maria's performance in this scene as well.
Oh, James. Come on, James. You must be joking.
The one other ending they added is basically an alternate version of the Rebirth ending, and it's called Bliss. I was genuinely caught by surprise when James entered that tape. And that's about it. Like, there's not really much that I can think of to say about this ending other than it's just a really cool concept. I like it as a fun extra ending. And it was just overall a really creative way to show James just fully going into that delusion. Absolute cinema. Enough said. Anyways, I just wanted to say this real quick before we get out of spoiler territory. There's this section in the labyrinth where you go through the same room over and over and over again, but it just gets weirder and more disturbing every time. Being that there's 3 rooms, I'm pretty sure that this is meant to show the 3 years of Mary getting more and more ill, and this is James just reliving that. But it could also be a PT reference. And yes, I am throwing this randomly at the end as an excuse to talk about PT, because look, it would have been weird to go on that long of a tangent in the Mary section. Okay, I already did one tangent there, which wasn't fully a tangent, but you know what? Let's just throw it in the shitpost section, right? So if this really is a PT reference, Bloober Team, I fucking love you. I mean, I already loved you, but like even more now. PT stood for Playable Trailer for the game Silent Hills, which was Kojima's attempt to revive the franchise, and it was going to be a collaboration between him, Guillermo del Toro, and Junji Ito. And you can't see it from this angle, but I got the whole Junji Ito collection just down there. Oh, I sure hope no one does anything bad with this material. If that game weren't canceled, it would have been like one of the best horror games just of all time, possibly the best. I mean, just PT alone stands on its own as a just really good short horror game. But going through that same room over and over again, like I was just happy to see that concept canonized in this version of the game, and it was just a really cool little reference I wanted to bring up. I'm gonna say it, this is definitely my game of the year right now. Even with Until Then, which I played on stream earlier this year, like that game was beautiful, but this is just, it's Silent Hill 2, man. I can't, this is like top 5 games for me. Like just, and the remake is just so good. There is so much here in this game that tells me that Bloober really did their research. They even put a reference to the Silent Hill HD collection that uses fucking Comic Sans on a sign that can only be accessed using a free cam mod. That's definitely some next level research right there. Like, and I really hope that people don't view this as a replacement for the original either. Like, the remake not being a clone of the original allows there to just be stuff that's great about both, and I mean, you've heard me talk about it this whole review, especially if you watch the story section. The remake just takes those same core ideas that the original had and just executed them in a way that feels fresh. And because it's really selling well, I just hope more than anything that Konami actually remakes 1, 3, and 4 with Bloober Team, because that is the one thing that they have to do. That will literally print money for them, and they just have to not fuck up this time. Also, they really should just do what they did with the Metal Gear Master Collection and just make it so you can play the original games officially rather than doing it through emulation. There is a lot more interest in Silent Hill now than there ever has been, so it's just the next logical choice. And the PC port for Silent Hill 2 is just abandonware. Like, you can't even get that on Steam. Why? The only one that you can actually legally buy now just from Konami is 4 on GOG.com. And when was the last time, if there even was one, that you bought something off of GOG.com? Well, why not just put it on Steam? Like, what is the issue here? Emulation is not something that just the average person is going to be willing to do. It is a time-consuming process. You got to go to a lot of links for a lot of places, maybe look up some YouTube tutorials. Like, it's a hassle. And some people don't own a PC that they can emulate things on, and they may just own a console. It's really just important for media preservation that these games are more readily available, but we're not going to pay on eBay and pay hundreds of dollars just to play an old game series when we could just emulate it. Like, and Konami doesn't make a dime off of that, so the only reason you have for buying old games like that is just for the fun of collecting, which honestly I personally understand. You know, I collect things just a little bit, but that's everything that I have to say about the Silent Hill 2 remake. Like, and I wanted to get everything out just in one video, just so that way anytime someone asks my opinion on it, because I'm going to be making more Silent Hill videos that are a lot more deliberate video essays than this one, which was kind of just showing the new stuff off, talking about the mechanics I liked and didn't like. I just want a video that I can point people to when they're like, what do you think of that remake? You know, like, and this is as descriptive as it can get. Also, I have filmed Sneeze Infection 2. I know I said that I would be dropping that first before this one, but I was like, if I focus on that, then I'm not really gonna have time to get this video out in a reasonable manner. Like, I'm already stretching it a little bit, but I had a ton of life stuff that I had to do. Like, I got a whole new job and everything, so I've been busy, but eventually I was able to get this out. You gotta strike while the iron is hot with concepts like this, and while I could have put out the other video earlier, the iron would have been really cold by the time that I put this out, and it's already cooling down some. But hey man, I just kept expanding these notes and making this video longer and longer. Like, I wasn't even initially gonna cover the story. I was just kind of be like, yeah, this game is good. Okay, that video's out. Here's the other video I was working on. But yeah, I think I'm also going to do a few more of these kind of format videos in the future where it's like a half scripted, half unscripted, you know, kind of a mix of some, you know, where I'm just kind of sitting at the desk talking about my ideas and referring to notes. So it's kind of scripted, kind of not. That is legit it for me, and I'm back in the shirt that I was wearing at that point of the video because I realized I forgot to record an outro as well. So yeah, this game is absolute cinema. I love it. I love you guys. Bye-bye. Also, check out me and my friend's gaming channel. It's called BS&B is Fun. Autumn was featured at this point in the video, and she's the main person over there. I'm only in some of the videos, but I edit all of them, so yeah.